Hello and welcome back to the Book Marketing Tips and Author Success Podcast. This is Penny Sansevieri.
And Amy Cornell.
And we're really excited about the show. I know we say it all the time. We're excited about all of our shows. But this one in particular was something, because one of the things that we are trying to do with our shows is really become more hyper-focused on a single topic, because some of the feedback that we've gotten from y'all has been, you love the topics, but sometimes there's a lot crammed into an episode. So we are also trying to break those down into, more bite-size, as it were, manageable pieces. I mean, Amy, because they tend to feel better, don't they, these shows, as we unpack them?
Yes, and you and I are both podcast consumers too.
Yeah.
And we both know how, no matter how much you love a topic or how much you can potentially get out of a show, it still gets very hard, at the end when it's included so much stuff to go, okay, what do I do now? And we want you all to have actionable things that you can walk away from and go, I'm going to do this differently. We realize that gets tough when we give you 5 or 6 different things to potentially run with at the end of a show.
Yeah, because a little bit, somebody used the term drinking from a fire hose. And I find that all of marketing, oftentimes, especially if you're very new to this industry, feels like drinking from a fire hose. So we want to try to avoid that. And with that, we're doing the first of 2-parter on approaching podcasts, getting booked on podcasts, because podcasts are, I want to say they're the new thing, but a lot of authors are very, very keen on being on podcasts, which is a great idea because they do well. As Amy said, we're both consumers of podcasts. We listen to a lot of different shows and formats, and even shows that, feature authors and book topics and things like that. But we're going to get into all of that in this episode. We also have a listener question that we're going to save for the end of the show today. So be sure to listen to the end. If you aren't already part of our texting group exclusive to our podcast, text the word podcast to 888-402-8940. And you can send us show ideas, send us listener questions. That's how we get all of our listener questions. Send us your listener questions and show feedback. Like I said, show ideas. That's where somebody, just mentioned, hey, your shows are great, but there's a lot we're dealing, you're dealing with a lot, you're figuring out a lot. And so then hence, that's how we build all of our shows. So with that, I think that, the majority of podcast listeners, it has been my experience anyway, are not necessarily looking for product pitches. They're looking for, insight, entertainment, education. I've actually purchased things not from the ads, because I always skip over the ads. Sorry, but I do. I will buy, especially if I'm listening to a podcast that features an author and I'm like, oh, that book sounds really interesting. There's always a link to the book in the show notes. I'll go over and click over the book. And many times I've ordered it because the guest was good, the guest was great and I really enjoyed listening to it. There's been some research. I want to say that it was Edison Research. We'll certainly have that in the show notes as well. Over 60% of podcast listeners say they listen to learn something new or for personal growth. And, really those two elements fit into whether you are listening to, a podcast about being more zen or, the completely other side of the coin, if you're listening to a podcast about the latest true crime story. I mean, those are really the only 2 reasons that I listen to podcasts. What about you, Amy? Oh dear. Okay, wait.
Really pulling back the curtain. No, honestly, most of mine is crime related, but I do follow actually a few podcasts that regularly feature authors of true crime. And I find those especially fascinating personally, because it's like I understand both sides. So I love hearing how the author did the research, why they started down this path in the first place. It's such a cool, mashup of things that I am into.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I can't listen to a lot of my podcasts with my kids. Let's put it that way.
But I mean, one of the things that I find where authors get it wrong in terms of pitching is that they're approaching interviews promotion first
Hmm.
as opposed to value first. And your book is the credential, it's not the content. And that to me is the biggest disconnect that authors have when they're going after podcasts.
Absolutely. Because I mean, it's true. Especially our clients, they hire us to help promote their book, right? And so much focus gets put on the book, the book, the book, the book. But you really have to understand when you're pitching, a lot of times, not just podcasts, you have to take a step back and remember what is in it for the recipient? What is
Yeah,
in it for the show? What is in it for that influencer? Believe it or not, they're not just doing this out of the kindness of their hearts, right? To help people promote their stuff for free.
right, exactly. And every host, or, if they're lucky enough to have a producer, every host or producer will say, will this conversation help my listeners?
Right.
At the end of the day, that's the only thing, they're not thinking, can I help this author sell books? That is not even, they understand, everybody, whether you're pitching television or, print media, whatever you're doing, obviously you're selling your book and they all know that. But to lead with the sale is never going to get you the interview. I don't care what you're pitching. Hosts are looking for expertise, perspective. And just so you know, we are going to cover fiction and nonfiction in both of the shows. So you're both going to get a slice of the pie, so to speak. But what hosts are really looking for is they're looking for expertise, perspective, experience, useful advice, a strong story. And we've said this before, we've done shows on podcasting before, I think more than 6 months ago, for sure. Listen to the shows. And I'm going to repeat that multiple times over these next shows. I cannot say that enough. We get pitched guests for our podcast. For those of you who have been listening for a while, you know that we've never had a guest on, right? And so first, you're wasting a pitch on us. Secondly, a lot of times what we are getting pitched is not something that we would cover anyway.
Right.
So, you
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And it matters. And for what it's worth, Penny says it all the time. Everything you do is your resume.
Yeah.
So you really, and not to freak anybody out, but that's why you really want to be thoughtful about who you're sending to, So you want to get it right. You want to show that you were engaged, that you did your research, you understand what they cover, you understand what they do, because, this is your first impression with the recipient, and you don't want it to be that you're not paying attention. Because for what it's worth, just because it doesn't work out now doesn't mean you might not be a good fit down the road if you do make a good first impression. Right. So that's always something to keep in the back of your mind too, that it's not just one shot only. You never know when somebody might go, you know what? I got this email from an author. They had this great angle. I couldn't use it at the time, but for whatever reason, it makes sense for them now. And they may reach back out. So that first impression is really critical. So you really want it to be that you are paying attention, you did your homework, you know what they need, you know what their listeners need, or their audience needs, and make sure you communicate that in a really thoughtful, concise way.
Right. Exactly. And as we always say, lean into the benefits, lean into the things that are actually going to be interesting to the listeners of the show, which is why you should be a listener first and foremost. Right. And an example of that would be like a fiction author, not a fiction author, a finance author pitching, I have a new book on money habits, just as an example. So that's like, I'm sorry, super boring. I would never lead a pitch that said, here's my book on money habits ever, because that's just super. But if you wrote something like, for example, why high income earners are still broke, boom. Now you've got somebody's attention. That's the difference between, leaning into I'm selling a book to I'm selling what this book can actually do for your audience, which is something that we always talk about. Amy, now that I've kind of done the lead into the nonfiction folks, do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah. I mean, I think, nonfiction authors, let's just be honest, you have a lot more options than fiction authors. Sorry,
Yeah.
fiction authors, it's just the competition is fiercer and the options are more narrow for you. We will get to you. But for nonfiction, if you get creative and if you are really an expert or you are really well versed in a particular area, you do have a lot of options and ways to be creative with this. So, but you need to pitch yourself as, a topic, like Penny said, that you can help people understand something better and not the book. You're pitching how to help people, you're not pitching the book, right? And
Yeah.
so the same thing like Penny said, telling them you wrote a leadership book, boring. And so many people have done that, right? But a better angle, 3 leadership mistakes first-time managers make, that is something that's a good takeaway. That is something that the host or the producer goes, yes, we have first-time managers. We have managers listening to our show. That they are a big part of our audience. This makes sense for what we're doing.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so you are solving a problem. So you are doing them a solid by saying, I've got something your listeners are already looking for. That makes that yes so much easier for the person on the other end of your email.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And, I mean, I think that it also goes without saying is first off, you want to be a fan of the show, but also make sure that the show is is the right fit for you. And this is where I see a lot of the disconnect with fiction authors in particular, because again, you have an opportunity. It's different than nonfiction because nonfiction has, there are a lot of podcasts that cater to various nonfiction topics. Um, but this is where I find that a lot of fiction authors are square peg round hole, right? They're trying
Right.
to go after podcasts that aren't necessarily like I had a fiction author say to me, I really want to be on Joe Rogan. Just I, like throwing that out there. And this is an actual example.
Right.
And I had a conversation with this person and I said, first off, when was the last time that you listened to the show? Well, I've never listened to the show, but I know it's really popular. So that's like mistake number one.
Mm-hmm.
And the show, to my knowledge, does not have authors on unless they're big celebrities, I don't think. Right. I mean, I think that's
Exactly.
you know what I mean?
No, 100% correct.
Right. So I think so when you're fiction, obviously there you have opportunities. Just make sure that you're pitching the right shows. The conversation around pitching fiction could be about, for example, the research behind the story, maybe the historical period, historical fiction authors. This is really where y'all can shine. The cultural topic, okay. Um, the real world issue that the story explores. So we've worked with books around, fictional books around domestic violence, for example, right? So that's a topic that can be expanded on. The author's personal experience, right? Or anything that might be in the zeitgeist, right? That the fiction author can, they can dial into. So, examples might be, for example, um, historical fiction, history podcasts potentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Exploring a different time period. Um, Crime thriller, obviously. True crime shows. I mean, I think so. Amy and I are both big true crime listeners. Um, I would say be cautious with that. I think there are elements that there are potentially shows that are crime adjacent that might feature you, but I think true crime, like some of the bigger true crime shows, Ashley Flowers show and things like that. I've never known them to have a fiction author on. Have you?
No. And I will say, and this is again to your point, Penny, of being a fan of the show and doing your due diligence. I do follow a couple shows that have started their own book clubs.
Oh, yes. Yes, yes,
And,
yes. I love that. Yes.
and so not all, and some of the books that they feature aren't always actual true crime, meaning written about. I mean, they do sometimes expand into other areas, but again, that is something that you really have to be clued in for. Don't just pitch every true crime show and say, hey, if you ever consider doing a book club, my fiction book would be perfect.
Right. Right. Exactly.
It's
Exactly.
a bit of an overreach, but but there are options out there. But again, this is going to be so much more beneficial, and we'll get into actual like pitching execution on the second part of this topic. But those are the things you want to look out for. And
Yeah.
why being an actual follower, fan, listener will really improve your response rate.
Right, exactly. And this is something that I know we're definitely going to mention in the pitching show, but in some cases, if the show doesn't have authors on necessarily, there are a couple of shows that I've actually mailed books to for authors who just, because they mention books on the show. So for example, Happy for No Reason, which is Gretchen Rubin's podcast, we've mailed some books there. They never, well, occasionally, very occasionally, they'll have authors on. But in some cases, your book might get mentioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
Send it. It can't hurt, right? To send the book to the host. So that's another opportunity where you won't necessarily get booked on the show, but if the book inspires the host, you might get a mention. And that is, that's awesome.
I know. Yeah, that was one thing, Penny, real quick before we move on from fiction.
Yeah.
I want to kind of dispel the idea, because these are very few and far between. So that's why, to your point, getting creative about connecting the dots and, knowing what really could be beneficial to either the host, their listeners, you know what I mean? Their whole brand is important. Because the idea that you're going to book a bunch of shows where the hosts are going to read your book and then talk about it on a full episode is very, very slim. You know what I mean? Like, those kind of shows are really few and far between nowadays. And candidly, they get booked up with major big time bestsellers. We're talking the kind of books you see walking through the airport and things like that, unfortunately, because there's only so many hours in a day. So the kind of shows where you're going to get like the full attention of the host for a full hour where they just talk about your book, kind of like an audio book club, that shouldn't necessarily be your primary focus or goal. Like, get more creative than that. I just want to throw that out there because we hear that a lot. That's kind of what people gravitate toward. And if you're spending all your energy thinking that's what you want or need, you're going to miss out on other opportunities that are probably more within your reach.
Well, but the other thing, though, too, is when you think about the length of the show, for example, so we've talked about this even with our own podcast, right? Keeping the length to 30 minutes, it seems to be where, people kind of sit, they're like, we can spend 30 minutes. But an hour listening to an author, man, you better be really compelling. You better be a super compelling interview. Like, sorry, but you're going to start to lose people at the 30-minute mark if you aren't an extremely compelling interview. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Just because, the majority of shows that I listen to that interview authors, the segments are around, I think they're around 15 to 20 minutes. And that is they're bookended. You would get it's 2 or 3 authors on any particular show. It works out well. You can skip forward to an author that, to a topic that you want to listen to. It gives the listener more variety. Again, these shows, they're catering to their listeners. That's how they're growing their base,
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are a lot of shows. And the other piece of it, though, that I think, too, is that, and I failed to mention this early on, the thing that really prompts a buy is a solid topic and a good interview. So, the host is going to throw a bunch of questions at you, but if you're not a good interview, and I've had topics that I've listened to, honestly, and that shall remain nameless, and shows where I'm like, oh, I really want to listen to this topic that sounds super interesting. And I was so bored.
Oh,
and I didn't buy the book because the interview, nothing to do with the host at all, but the author wasn't prepared or wasn't confident or whatever. So that's the other piece of it, though, too, is that, if you're going to start to do podcasts and you have your SaaS site set on some of the bigger shows, awesome, right? But maybe you want to start with something that isn't quite as high profile, because you really need to be ready for that.
100%.
Well, right. So, and I think that, reframing kind of what podcast success, actually looks like. Podcast interviews, and I think this is really true for all media, podcast interviews rarely create an instant sales spike. And part of the reason for that is not because, I just told you about the interview that was so uninspiring that I didn't end up buying the book, But part of the reason for that is because we all listen to shows at different paces, right? So Amy, who is just so into true crime, I can guarantee you that she has listened to all of the new shows in her feed way before I have, right? And in fact, I finally stopped texting her about, oh my gosh, did you hear about such and such? Because I know that she's already gonna have heard it because she's so far ahead of me on some of these topics. And that's part of the reason why sometimes the sales spike can feel a little disappointing because people listen to podcasts at different times. But the one thing that I will say, when I teach a class on how to market your book without social media, and we've actually done a podcast on that. Podcast interviews, podcast shows have a shelf life of 172 days. So when you think about, like, if you're putting something on social media, you have basically 5 minutes to maybe an hour to get somebody's attention, right? But with the podcast, it sits in their feed. I've gone back to shows that are older. I mean, not generally news shows or true crime, because at 172 days, that story has already been in the news and done and potentially overdone, right? But that's part of the reason why a lot of times you're not going to see that sales spike right away, because people listen at different times, right? But they can create a ton of credibility, discoverability. I mean, search visibility with podcasts is phenomenal,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Huge.
I mean, we've seen that even with our own show, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I agree 100%. Like, that is what and again, back to sounding like a broken record, but you're building your resume, right? This is what you're putting out there. This is what people are going to know you for. This is what other opportunities are going to see, other hosts, other editors, other producers. You know what I mean? So this is huge. Like,
Yeah.
booking anything. And anybody that's been listening for a while, that's listened to any of our other media shows, know that we say that all the time. But truly, every win is a win. There is no such thing as too small when it comes to coverage, because you need all of it. You absolutely need all of it. There's really this idea that you can skip the line and go straight to the big stuff is really not a thing.
Right. And I missed two of them on this on our list. Do you want to take those?
Oh, yeah, yes, the shareable content, right? This is also
Yes.
huge. That is one that is massive because, again, and a lot of authors it's a pleasant surprise, aren't prepared for that, I would say, Penny. Like, I can't tell you how many of our clients, they start booking coverage, they start booking interviews and all this stuff, and they don't have anywhere to put it. And it's like, all right, you need to get that page up on your website, or you need to dedicate a section of your website to your coverage, because that is huge and that is massive for your credibility.
Yeah.
And obviously it's great for anywhere that you engage with your audience, it's good for. So if you do social, it's great for social. If you do a newsletter, it's great for your newsletter. You know what I mean? You really want to keep this out there. I've even seen some authors link to particularly impressive interviews in their email signatures, Penny, which is really smart.
I love that.
Like, we'll say we don't talk about this enough, but I know we've said it before. Like, you always want to challenge yourself to find 3 ways to use anything that's a win for you, right?
Yeah.
How can you use this win in at least 3 different ways, because then you're making the most of it. You want to milk it for all it's worth.
Well, and I think that this really is, we're sort of flipping the script on this, right? So authors, thinking about, instead of thinking about podcasts as promotion, start to think of them as audience builders, which really is an exceptional way to keep building your momentum, relationship building, authority building, long-term visibility. I mean, those are the things that can be tremendously valuable. And then, the bonus, the byproduct of that is, you might sell some books. And I think that's awesome. But one thing builds on another.
Right. Absolutely. So this is the kind of thing that when we talk to authors and they say, I feel stuck, or I can't get over that hump, or I just feel like I'm doing all the right things, but nobody knows me yet. I can't see, you know what I mean? Like, they kind of feel they're chomping at the bit to, like, kind of get to that next level. Getting on a podcast and getting that kind of coverage and expanding how you present yourself to your audience is really, really fantastic. So, we talk a lot about doing all the right things. again, getting on a podcast and having that medium as part of your resume is, I mean, you should be really impressed with yourself. So it is absolutely worth spending the time and the energy to, kind of work this into your self-promotion for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the next show, we are going to talk about, the biggest mistakes that we've seen authors make when pitching podcasts. We've sort of we dipped into that somewhat in the show. I realize there's a lot of crossover, and also we're going to talk about why most pitches never even get open, which is like it's all of our worst nightmares, right? When our pitches don't even get opened or responded to, and oh my gosh. All right, so quick listener question, kind of listener feedback. We really wanted to do this on the show, and since we have some time. So somebody wrote in and said, I know that I am very fortunate to have my hardcover do so well for now over 2 years. Awesome. But now my trade paperback is going to come out in late September 2026. Please do an episode on treating the subsequent trade paperback launch as a relaunch opportunity. But now the author has more experience. I love that they added that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it should be treated as a new book. My book will indeed have updates to the epilogue and the subject's happy life and feeling warmth for his town before his death. Okay, that's more about the book. That's more specific. But basically the core premise of this is that the book will have updates to the epilogue, and the paperback is September 2026. So just, a little bit later this year. First off, congratulations that your hardcover has done so well for over 2 years. I think that's awesome. And we will definitely do a show on this. Let me just say right out, and I'm going to have Amy throw this to Amy just to get her feedback on this as well. You should treat this like a brand new book. My opinion, the biggest takeaway, treat it like a brand new book, because you're going to have a lot of people who will gravitate to the paperback because that's what they read, right? Just like people who gravitate to ebooks. Mm-hmm. It's a fantastic new opportunity to get the book out there, especially. And again, this is a situation where this author is now building on the momentum that a hardcover book has already, kind of paved the way for, right?
Absolutely. And I think to your point, people are drawn to different formats.
Yeah.
And, price points do matter. No, books are not super expensive in the big scheme of things, but what does matter is that readers / consumers, shoppers, that they have an idea of how much they want to spend on books. You can't do anything about that. Right. So I would say definitely, especially if your hardcover was priced like most hardcovers are on the more expensive end, then going back out there with your paperback is a huge opportunity to convert those people that you already introduced yourself to, but maybe didn't click buy because they weren't quite convinced enough to spend the money on the hardcover. And it's typically not what they buy. There's all these kind of, peripheral reasons why they may just not have been pushed over that last little hump to click buy, but this may be the opportunity.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens when you release a Kindle book separately, as well. Like if there's any staggering in any of your formats, you really have to think about all those reasons why it may not have worked for that format and how you can convert those people that were already on your radar, not, in addition to obviously introducing yourself to new people, which you should always be doing, but those people that are in your orbit that still haven't bought, you may clinch that sale with this next release.
Absolutely. And the thing that I really love about this note is that because the book was out 2 years ago, right? So it's not like the paperback released 6 months ago and I'm sorry, the hardcover released 6 months ago and now the paperback's coming out. 2 years, right? So yeah. You're going to have people like, for example, let's say you did some influencer pitching or something and not everybody responds when you pitch them because they're busy or their to be read piles are too big or what they're on vacation, whatever. Mm-hmm. You have an opportunity to go after them now, right? I really love this. I am so excited. I really want you to, I want this author to stay in touch with us and let us know what transpired. And we'll definitely do a show on this. I'm not exactly sure when. We're sort of retooling some of our summer shows right now, but congratulations on the success. I think this is really awesome. I just want to remind you, if you are not part of our texting group, text the word podcast to 888-402-8940 and send us your questions, show ideas, show feedback, all the things. We love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.